Hi and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to be talking about how to deal with a defensive employee. So I'm going to explain 3 different steps in dealing with an employee who's defensive. The first is self-control and self-regulation to make sure that you don't slip into the common kind of negative interactions, which tend to develop when someone's more prone to being defensive than others. I'll talk about how to interrupt and stop the negative reciprocal spiral. What tends to happen when people are defensive is that we either become defensive or potentially critical as a result, and then that gives the other person more ammunition and evidence to prove that we were being critical after all, and therefore they tend to be more justified in their defensiveness. So I'm going to explain some of the common inadvertent ways that you might be communicating criticism so that you can first of all prevent pushing the other person's buttons by mistake, and then I'll talk about how to assertively name this pattern. The fact that every time you give them feedback, they start talking about staff shortages in their team, for example, or whatever the pattern is that you've noticed, and then how to shift the conversation towards future problem-solving expectations, that kind of thing. I hope that it's useful for you. If you're interested in more of these types of resources in dealing with workplace conflict, please consider pressing subscribe and like. This is a tiny, brand new little YouTube channel, and so that would make a massive difference if you'd be willing to do that. Thank you in advance if so. So the first step in dealing with employee defensiveness has to be about self-regulation and self-care. When we're dealing with someone who's very defensive, I don't know about you, but I find it just incredibly frustrating. Over time, it can be distracting and actually a little bit exhausting. Every time you raise an issue with someone, they constantly need to explain how it's not their fault and someone else should have done the right thing and they were never given the training, and after all, this is the 4th new document management system that they've been forced to use this year or whatever it is. It's like Groundhog Day, and well, I mean, as if you were in a situation where you're just reliving the same conversation again and again. Of course, that reaches a point where we're just like, I just can't deal with this anymore. And what tends to happen then is that we pay the price for that. We turn to negative coping strategies like alcohol or gambling or social media or online shopping or whatever else it might be. Or the frustration and resentment that's been building up in us might spill out. We're more snappy with our kids, for example, or more irritable and reactive with our partner. So in terms of self-care and self-regulation, there's probably 2 areas that's worth considering. First, during a difficult conversation with someone who's becoming defensive, you will need to do something strategic, like a deliberate strategy to keep yourself calm, because it's very likely that you'll start to get your own buttons pushed at some point, particularly if they're accusing you of something and you feel like that's unfair. You know, you're always picking on me. I am not picking on you. It's my job to give you feedback as your manager. And before we know it, we've been sucked into a distracting conflict. So taking a few deep breaths, being mindful, concentrating on your senses, wiggling your toes and feel the feeling of the socks in your shoes. All of these types of things are really effective for anchoring our attention in the present, which stops our mind from spinning about the past and worrying about the future. So doing something deliberately during the conversation is the first part that's very important. The other part will be longer term self-care. After a day of dealing with this particularly annoying person, when you go home, what do you need to do to look after yourself? Is it taking a few minutes to have a shower, maybe a cold shower to reset the nervous system? Taking a few minutes in your car to do some deep breathing before you go in and have to deal with the kids and all of the chaos in the house? Or going to the gym, or going for a walk with your dog, or hanging out with someone who fills you up and gives you energy? I mean, you'll know what you need in that kind of situation, but these are the types of interactions that drain us. And if we don't find a way to refill our bucket, what that means is that there's a price to pay somewhere along the way. The second thing that you need to keep in mind when you're dealing with a staff member who's very defensive is to avoid accidentally criticizing them. There's some particularly common ways that this occurs in workplace communication, and a lot of the time it's accidental. Part of it might be about the questions that you ask. Saying to someone something like, "Why did you do that?" Of course, that feels like criticism, and what tends to happen is that the person becomes defensive. And if you're already dealing with a staff member who tends to be defensive at the best of times, well, this is a recipe that we can probably know what to expect from here. The other kinds of questions that often cause defensiveness in particular are asking too many closed-ended questions in a row. Are you sure? Have you got the resources that you need? Are you sure that you do? Are you absolutely sure that you've got enough? Yes, for goodness sakes. Like, don't you trust me? If we do too much checking and making sure everything's on track, or too many offers for help, it sort of implies that the other person might not have the capacity to do whatever they need to do. So, of course, then they might need to feel like they prove themselves, which manifests in that defensive type of response. Expressing too much emotion is another thing that commonly triggers defensiveness. When you're dealing with someone who tends to be very defensive, I often say just keep things very matter of fact, just professional, it's candid, it's to the point. So I wouldn't say something like, I'm so frustrated that you keep making mistakes in the paperwork. For goodness sakes, it's not rocket science. How many times do I need to show you what's expected? It's better to say something like, look, this is the third time that you've made a mistake this week. I've previously walked you through what's needed, what's going on. Is there a particular issue with it on your end? Because I just want to be clear that if this behavior doesn't change, this is what the consequence would be. So we can still be very firm and assertive, but what we don't want to do is introduce our own emotions, because what that tends to do is increase that level of pressure, the escalation in the other person, and then defensiveness as a result. Overreacting is another common cause of defensiveness. So if there's a small issue and the person feels like we're overreacting, it's likely that they would, I guess, feel then they need to up their side of the thing as well and overly defend their position or whatever else it might be. But underneath a lot of that, I think, is just a lack of clarity around expectations, or what the staff member might perceive as a lack of consideration given to the context. For example, if their team has failed to meet a deadline in a project that they were running, and they don't feel like you're aware or you're not paying enough attention to the fact that they've had a lot of staff off sick, then they're going to just keep repeating that again and again, which is the source of some of that defensiveness that might come up. So a more effective strategy from a manager in that kind of situation would be to first clarify and then acknowledge whether those expectations are realistic and what the effect was of the context and other factors outside of the person's control. So if they say something like, well, I don't know what you expect, I've had half my team off sick over the past month. First, we would clarify, oh gosh, I didn't realize it was that much. How many staff have been off and for how long? Can you just give me a ballpark idea of what kinds of coming and goings that you've been dealing with? So we sort of get to the heart of this excuse. Well, how much of an excuse is it? What are the facts that we're actually talking about here? And then we could acknowledge it and decide how to respond. To be honest, if someone's very overly defensive, it's likely that their excuse isn't 100% valid. So you might do something like just acknowledging it. Yeah, I get it. I understand what you're saying in terms of the staff that have been absent, and that has been an extra hurdle that you've had to work around all the way through this last few weeks. At the same time, given the fact that you knew that the deadline was approaching and I've encouraged you to come and let me know if you're not able to meet it, it's still something that I need to consider, because this isn't the kind of behavior that, we can have moving forward. So we sort of just acknowledge, yes, I know that you've had the staff turnover, but nevertheless, this is what I'm expecting, or this is what I'm asking you to do. So the final step then, in terms of dealing with that defensive staff member, we've looked at the self-regulation and self-care. We've made sure that we're not inadvertently pushing their buttons by some of those common mistakes and accidentally communicating in a way that's perceived as critical. The final step is to find the balance between understanding or empathy and assertiveness and firmness. So in terms of the patterns, if the person keeps being defensive, for example, you talk to them about an issue in their work and they're constantly referring to how the other team are also making mistakes or whatever else it might be, we should acknowledge that, but redirect to behavior and expectations. I understand that you've observed other members of the team also having a similar kind of issue. This meeting's to focus on you and your performance. So what I'd like to discuss is, what is a reasonable expectation moving forward? Yeah, I totally appreciate where you're coming from, and I'll need to follow up with those other staff members as well. During this meeting, though, what I'd like to talk about is ... So I hope that that's helpful for you, thinking about some of those strategies that you can use for dealing with staff defensiveness and employee defensiveness. This is a reasonably new YouTube channel. I'm a professional mediator myself. I do training in conflict resolution skills. So if you've got a question about something I've talked about in this video, or a topic for a future video, a particularly difficult person you're dealing with, a horrible situation you're navigating at your work, a traumatic incident that happened 10 years ago and you still think about every now and then, I'd love to hear from you.